My name is Billie Carter. I'm 27 years old, and the first time my parents told me I had 2 days to get out of the house my grandmother left behind, I didn't scream, cry, or ask either of them how they could stand in my kitchen and say something that cold with such calm faces. I just stood there with my hand around a mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm and listened. My mother was the one speaking. She always was when there was something cruel to be dressed up as reason. She had a way of softening her voice when she wanted other people to believe she was the injured one, the patient one, the one trying to make a difficult situation bearable for everyone. My father stood next to her with his jaw set and his hands in his coat pockets, like the matter was already settled, and all that remained was for me to stop being inconvenient. My younger sister, Sienna, leaned against the counter with one ankle crossed over the other, watching me with that tiny, satisfied smile people wear when they already believe the ending belongs to them. "The house is too much for you, Billie," my mother said. "You know that. You're taking this personally when it should be a practical decision." I said nothing. My father finally spoke. "You need to be out by Friday." 2 days, 48 hours, to pack up the only place in the world that had ever felt like mine. Sienna glanced around the kitchen, then at the window over the sink, then at the old pine cabinets my grandmother had once painted herself. She smiled like she was already mentally moving her own things in. "Honestly," she said lightly, "it'll be easier if we do this quickly. Dragging it out will just make it uglier." What they wanted was a scene. I knew that as clearly as I knew my own name. They wanted tears, outrage, pleading, one desperate argument they could repeat later to friends and neighbors, and their lawyer if it came to that. They wanted proof that I was unstable, emotional, selfish. They wanted me to make this easier for them by losing control. But I already knew something they didn't. I knew what my grandmother had done 6 weeks before she died. I knew what was sealed in the envelope behind the loose panel in the study wall. And I knew that the moment they discovered it, every ounce of confidence standing in my kitchen would drain right out of their faces. So I nodded once, said, "Okay," and walked past them with my coffee mug still in my hand. Behind me, Sienna let out a tiny laugh under her breath. By that night, my mother had called me 8 times. By morning, her voicemails had started to change shape. The first few were stern, then they turned anxious. By Thursday afternoon, there was something close to panic in her voice, but by then, it was already too late. The truth is, by the time my parents gave me those 2 days, I had already spent years learning exactly who mattered to them and exactly who didn't. The house sat at the edge of Westmere Cove, a quiet coastal town that looked beautiful in postcards and lonely in winter. It was a stone and cedar house with deep windowsills, a broad front porch, and old floors that creaked like they remembered every person who had ever crossed them. The back of the property sloped down toward the water, where reeds bent in the wind and gulls screamed at dawn. To strangers, it looked valuable. That was the word people always used: valuable, charming, historic, prime waterfront. The kind of place people asked about in lowered voices, like property itself was something intimate. To me, it was where my grandmother taught me how to peel apples in one long ribbon without breaking the skin. It was where my grandfather taught me to repair a stuck window and sharpen a kitchen knife, and judge people by what they did when there was no applause waiting for them. It was where I first learned that silence could feel safe. When I was little, the house smelled like cinnamon, cedar, and whatever soup my grandmother had on the stove. She had a small radio in the kitchen and sang under her breath without ever seeming to notice she was doing it. My grandfather was steadier, less obvious. He believed in fixing things before throwing them away, and in showing up even when no one was keeping score. He was not sentimental, at least not on the surface, but when my grandmother laughed, he always looked at her first, and even as a child, I understood that love could be quiet and still be the strongest thing in a room. My parents lived 40 minutes away in a large white house with smooth countertops and too many decorative pillows and a front door nobody ever used because everyone came through the garage. My mother liked things that looked impressive. My father liked things that stayed under his control. Sienna liked being admired. I learned that very early. She was younger than me by 3 years, prettier in the glossy, obvious way people noticed at once, and far better at giving our parents what they wanted. She laughed at the right moments, wore the right clothes, cared about the right people. She knew how to make selfishness look like sparkle. I was the quieter one, the one who stayed too long at family dinners, helping clear plates, the one who noticed when my grandmother's hands started shaking before anyone else admitted it, the one who heard the strain under the polite conversations years before the family finally cracked open. My grandmother's illness did not arrive dramatically. It began in little slips nobody wanted to name. A misplaced set of keys, sugar in the refrigerator, her calling me by her cousin's name and then laughing it off. My mother said, "She's getting older." My father said, "People forget things." Sienna said, "She's fine. You worry too much." But I was the one there on a Tuesday afternoon when the kettle boiled dry on the stove while my grandmother stood in the hallway holding an empty teacup and looking lost in her own house. I was in graduate school then, finishing a degree I had once thought would take me into hospital administration somewhere in the city. I lived in a cramped apartment and drove home on weekends at first, then twice a week, then nearly every day. The house in Westmere Cove became less of a place I visited and more of a second life I slipped into whenever the first one stopped making sense. I became the one who knew which pharmacy still had her medication in stock when the chain stores were back ordered. I learned how to sort pills into those little plastic boxes with days of the week stamped on them. I made spreadsheets of appointments and called the home nurse and spent my evenings answering questions my grandmother had already asked twice in the last 10 minutes. I sat beside her while she looked at old family photo albums and told the same stories in different orders. I paid the heating bill online when my grandfather forgot. I replaced groceries. I cleaned up after accidents no one spoke about afterward. My parents always had an excuse. There was a conference, there was a dinner, there was a client, there was a fundraiser, there was always some emergency in their own carefully arranged lives that outranked the slow collapse of the woman who had once held all of us together. Sienna was worse, because at least my parents occasionally performed guilt. Sienna treated the whole thing like an inconvenience that had been scheduled badly. She came one Saturday in late spring, carrying white tulips and a lemon tart from a bakery in town, took 3 photographs on the porch with my grandmother, posted one online with the caption, "Every moment matters," and left before dinner because she had plans in the city. I remember standing at the sink after she left, washing mixing bowls, while I heard her laughing on the porch into her phone. I know, she said. "It's sad, but the house is incredible. If they ever sell it, it'll be gone in a second." My grandmother was asleep in the next room. My grandfather heard every word. He did not say anything then. He just sat at the kitchen table, longer than usual after dinner, turning a spoon over and over in his hands, but I saw the way his face changed. It was not surprise, it was recognition. As if he had finally stopped asking himself whether he was being unfair and accepted that he was not. The more I showed up, the less the rest of my family did. No one asked how I was balancing school and caregiving. No one asked whether I was sleeping. No one asked what it felt like to watch a person fade in uneven pieces, some days sharp as ever, some days lost, in a fog so thick she once stood in the pantry crying because she could not remember why she had opened the door. What they did ask about whenever they called was paperwork. Was the property tax still due in September? Were the insurance documents in the study desk? Had anyone updated the kitchen? Appraisal after the storm repairs? I noticed. My grandfather noticed too. When my grandmother died, the house became so quiet it almost rang. She slipped away in early November in the small bedroom overlooking the water, with the curtains half open, because she had always liked moonlight. I was there. My grandfather was there. The nurse was there. My parents arrived 22 minutes after it was over. Sienna came an hour later, wearing a camel coat and sunglasses, even though the sky was gray. The funeral was full. The reception was fuller. My mother accepted condolences, like she had been the one keeping vigil for months. My father shook hands and talked about family strength. Sienna cried delicately and let people hug her. I stood in the kitchen washing glasses, because if I stopped moving, I thought I might come apart. 2 weeks after the funeral, I was helping my grandfather button his cardigan when he gripped my wrist with surprising strength and said, "They think I don't know what they're waiting for." I looked at him. He stared past me into the hallway toward the study, toward the front of the house, toward everything we were both trying not to say too plainly. "They are not waiting for me to feel better," he said. "They are waiting for me to be finished." There was no point lying to him. There was no point denying what had already become obvious to both of us. He let go of my wrist and leaned back against the chair. "You're the only one who came here for us," he said. "Everyone else came here for what comes after." That was the moment I understood the story my family would tell later was never going to be about love. It was going to be about entitlement dressed as concern. A few days after that, my grandfather asked me to drive him into town. He said he needed to take care of estate business. And he said it in such a flat tone that anyone else might have missed the weight of it, but I knew him. He minimized things when he had already made up his mind. We drove to a low brick office above the marina where a lawyer named Daniel Mercer had practiced for 30 years. He was not flashy. He did not have polished shoes or a booming voice or framed newspaper articles about courtroom victories. He had careful hands and a habit of listening all the way to the end of a sentence before he answered. My grandfather trusted him, which was enough for me. At first, Daniel asked me to wait in the reception area. 20 minutes later, he opened the door and said, "Billie, he'd like you in here." My grandfather was sitting very straight in the chair by the desk, a legal folder open in front of him, his glasses low on his nose. There was a notary seal on the corner of the desk and a yellow pad covered in Daniel's neat handwriting. "Sit down," my grandfather said. I sat. Daniel folded his hands. My grandfather looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "I made a mistake years ago," he said. "I assumed blood was enough to guarantee decency." No one said anything. "The house, the accounts, all of it, were set up to pass one way. I'm changing that." I remember the exact sensation that moved through me then. It was not triumph. It was dread. Because I knew instantly what the rest of the family would call this: manipulation, undue influence, the selfish granddaughter taking advantage. They had already spent years preparing that version of me in case they ever needed it. "I don't want this because they failed," I said quietly. "I don't want you doing something out of anger." My grandfather's expression did not change. "This is not anger," he said. "This is correction." Daniel slid a document toward me and explained what had been prepared. The house would be transferred into a trust. My grandfather had chosen me as trustee and primary beneficiary, with specific language designed to make a forced sale difficult and any challenge costly. There were other provisions too: a donation to the local library, funds set aside for the nurse who had helped care for my grandmother, bequests to a few old friends. The structure was deliberate, careful, and astonishingly hard to undo. "This is not a gift," my grandfather said again when he saw the look on my face. "This is protection. Houses like this don't just hold people, they expose them." I asked him if he was sure. He looked almost offended. "Of course I'm sure." Then, Daniel said the thing that stayed with me long after everything else turned louder. "People who feel entitled to something," he said, "always describe boundaries as cruelty." My grandfather signed that day. The notary stamped the pages. I signed where Daniel indicated. On the drive home, my grandfather looked out at the water and said almost to himself, "Now I can rest." Over the next month, Daniel and I handled everything quietly. Deeds were recorded, documents were stored, copies were made, and on Daniel's advice, almost no one was told. He believed what I secretly believed too, that the truth of my family's intentions would reveal itself more cleanly if they thought I was defenseless. He was right. My grandfather died in January during a hard rainstorm that rattled the windows all night. He had been declining steadily, and yet when the moment came, the house still felt shocked by it. I sat beside him for the last 3 hours while he drifted in and out of sleep. The last clear thing he said to me was, "Don't let them make you feel guilty for being chosen." After the funeral, my parents changed almost at once. They did not become openly vicious immediately. That would have been too easy to resist. Instead, they became strategic. My mother started calling every few days to check on me, and the calls always somehow drifted toward the house. Was I managing? Had I thought about what upkeep might cost? Wasn't it a lot for one person? My father started dropping by with opinions about deferred maintenance, insurance liabilities, market timing. Sienna wandered room to room when she visited, touching curtains, opening cabinets, asking whether I'd ever considered lightening the place up. One night I came back from the grocery store and found her in the upstairs hall, holding swatches of paint against the wall like she was trying on futures. "What are you doing?" I asked. She turned and laughed. "Relax. I'm just imagining." "This isn't yours to imagine." That was the first time something sharp crossed her face. Everything doesn't have to be a fight, Billie. But that was the point. There had been a fight for years. I had just been the only one tired enough to see it clearly. The safe in the study had always fascinated my family. It was built into the wall behind a painting of a harbor my grandparents bought on their honeymoon, and everyone assumed anything truly important would be hidden inside it. Daniel suggested we use that assumption, so we did. Inside the safe, I placed a sealed envelope in my grandfather's handwriting, a certified copy of the trust documents, a letter from Daniel confirming the effective transfer, and a separate recording my grandfather had made on one of his clearer days. His own voice, stating plainly that he knew exactly what he was doing and exactly why he was doing it. On top of all of that, I placed a single typed page that read, "If you have opened this looking for something to take, then you already know why you were left out." Then I waited. It took less time than Daniel had predicted. 6 weeks later, my mother asked me to come to dinner at my parents' house. I said no. The following weekend, my father showed up unannounced with Sienna and spoke to me in the driveway about reasonable next steps. I told him I did not know what he meant. Sienna rolled her eyes. My father said, "We can do this gently, or we can do it the hard way." On Wednesday, they chose hard. That was the afternoon they stood in my kitchen and told me I had until Friday to leave. The 2 days between that conversation and Friday were some of the strangest of my life. I packed boxes so the performance would look believable. I filled them with books and winter scarves and kitchen linens I had no intention of moving out. I labeled them with a black marker and carried them into the guest room where anyone glancing in would think I had accepted defeat. At the same time, I backed up every text message, saved every voicemail, and sent copies to Daniel. My mother called Wednesday night and said in a syrupy voice, "I'm worried about you being alone." Then, without even taking a breath, she added, "Please remember that the silver tea service is family property and not yours to remove." My father called Thursday morning pretending to be practical. "Dragging this out will only embarrass everyone." He used the word everyone like. He always did when he meant himself. Sienna texted me a photograph of a white stone kitchen with brass fixtures and wrote, "This would look beautiful here once the place feels younger." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. The house where my grandmother forgot how to tie her apron, where my grandfather sat through long wet evenings after burying his wife, where I had spent months cleaning pill bottles and folding laundry and paying bills and learning what devotion looked like without witnesses. To Sienna, it was a before picture. Thursday evening, my mother arrived alone with a paper bag from a bakery I used to love in college. She stood on the porch in a cream coat that probably cost more than my first rent payment and smiled at me with exhausted sadness. Can we please not do this like enemies? She asked. We're not doing anything like enemies, I said. Her smile twitched. Billie. I let her in because neighbors were watching from across the street, and because some part of me still wanted to hear whether there was anything human left in her when no one was performing for an audience. There wasn't. She set the pastries on the counter and sighed. Your father is under pressure. Sienna's wedding is this year. Everybody is stretched. This house could solve a lot for all of us. All of us. I leaned against the sink. It always becomes all of us when you want something from me. That's unfair. No, I said. It's just not flattering. Her face hardened in an instant. There it was, the real thing beneath the soft voice. You're making a mistake, she said. You always have this way of making everything harder than it needs to be. I learned from you. For a second, I thought she might slap me. Instead, she inhaled, smiled again, and said, Friday then. When she left, I locked the door and stood in the kitchen, staring at the untouched bag of pastries until I finally threw it into the trash. Friday came in with a low gray sky and the kind of coastal cold that made the water look metallic. By afternoon, the house felt almost sentient with waiting. I made tea. I watered the herbs on the windowsill. I folded blankets that did not need folding. At 4:57, headlights swung across the front room. They arrived almost theatrically on time. My father came in first, carrying himself like a man who expected obedience, because obedience had always eventually been extracted from everyone around him. My mother followed, already pale with tension. Sienna came last in tall boots and a fitted coat, her lipstick bright, her expression shining with expectation. She looked toward the guest room and said, That's all you packed? I said nothing. My father removed his gloves slowly. Where's the safe key? It's where it has always been, I said. Top drawer of the study desk. He stared at me, as if waiting for more. When none came, he turned and headed upstairs. My mother and Sienna followed him. I stayed in the kitchen long enough to count to 20. Then I went up after them. The study smelled faintly of cedar and dust, and the ghost of my grandfather's pipe tobacco, though he had not smoked in years. The safe stood open behind the lifted painting. My father was holding the typed page. My mother had one hand to her mouth. Sienna was staring at the envelope. What is this? My father asked without looking at me. He no longer sounded commanding. He sounded winded. Keep reading, I said. My mother snatched the papers from him first. She read fast, then slow, then fast again. The color drained out of her face in sections. Sienna grabbed the trust documents and scanned them, then looked at my father, then at me, then back down, as if the words might rearrange themselves if she blinked hard enough. My father opened the envelope in my grandfather's handwriting. He read in total silence. That was the moment I knew they understood, not emotionally, not morally, legally. The room changed all at once. Every trace of superiority collapsed into something rawer. Fear. Real fear. What did you do? My mother whispered. I looked at her. I listened. Sienna's voice rose half an octave. This has to be fake. Grandpa would never... He did, I said. You manipulated him. No, I said. I helped him see clearly. My father still hadn't spoken. He was reading. Daniel's letter now, then the trust again, scanning for weakness, the way men like him always do when they realize a door has shut without their permission. There has to be a challenge route, Sienna snapped. People don't just leave a family property to one granddaughter. My father finally looked up. Stop talking. She fell silent at once. My mother turned toward me with shaking hands. Billie, you don't understand the damage this will do. I almost laughed. To what? To the family? I said. You mean to your plans. That landed. They left 10 minutes later, with no dignity left intact. My mother forgot her purse on the study chair and had to come back for it. My father did not look at me as he went downstairs. Sienna did. If hate had a temperature, the air would have split. The first voicemail came 11 minutes after they drove away. Billie, please call me. Please do not take any further action until we've spoken calmly. The second came from my father, clipped and furious. You need to stop whatever this is and call me immediately. The third was from my mother again, and this time I could hear the panic under the polish. We can resolve this privately. There is no need to turn this into a legal humiliation. Legal humiliation. That phrase told me almost everything. I didn't answer. By Saturday morning, the story had already begun circulating in town because my mother had never met a narrative she couldn't weaponize if she got to it first. Westmere Cove is the kind of place where news travels through grocery aisles and church foyers and hardware store lines. People don't even mean to gossip there half the time. Information just moves the way weather does. By noon, I had received 3 texts from acquaintances asking if I was all right, and one from a woman at church saying my mother was heartbroken and hoping for peace. Peace, in my mother's vocabulary, has always meant surrender in a tone soft enough to be called mutual. Daniel had warned me about this. Property disputes are never just about property, he said when I called him Saturday afternoon. They're about narrative. Keep your records. Let them overplay their hand. So I did. I saved every voicemail. I printed every text. I made notes of dates, visits, comments, threats. I gathered invoices, pharmacy receipts, repair bills, gas receipts from the years I had driven back and forth taking care of my grandparents. The nurse wrote a statement confirming that I had been the primary family caregiver. The handyman who fixed the porch steps wrote another confirming that my parents had never once been present during any repair visit he had made in 3 years. And then, because careless people often mistake panic for intelligence, Sienna made my job easier. On Sunday night, she texted me by accident, meaning to send it to my mother, I later learned. It read, "If she still won't cooperate, tell Dad to use the debt issue. She'll fold if she knows everyone will find out why we need the house sold fast." She unsent it within seconds, but not before I took a screenshot. That one message cracked the whole thing open. I had long suspected there was more urgency under my father's confidence than he wanted anyone to see. Daniel dug carefully, lawfully, and by Tuesday, he called me with the answer. My father's business was not merely under pressure. It was failing. A commercial loan had tightened. Personal debts had been leveraged against future earnings that were no longer arriving. The house was not sentimental leverage for them. It was liquid escape. When I understood that, every comment of the last year rearranged itself into its true shape. Sienna's sudden obsession with wedding timelines. My mother's talk of what's best for all of us. My father's impatience. None of it had ever been about family continuity. They wanted the house sold before anyone knew how desperate they were. The legal challenge arrived that Thursday. My mother filed it in her own name first, with my father attached later. The claim was exactly what Daniel predicted, that my grandfather had been frail and influenced, that I had isolated him, that the trust was the product of manipulation by a granddaughter with undue control over his final affairs. Reading it made my hands shake, not from fear, but from the particular kind of disgust that comes when people take the years you spent loving someone and try to turn them into evidence against you. Daniel was unruffled. "Let them commit to that version," he said. "Then we show the court what they came here for." The hearing date was set for 6 weeks later. Those 6 weeks were ugly in all the familiar ways. My mother performed grief and confusion for anyone who would listen. My father tried intimidation, then reason, then silence. Sienna alternated between contempt and pleading, depending on who she thought she was speaking to. One afternoon, she cornered me in the parking lot outside the florist and said, "Why are you doing this? No one even wants you there alone forever." I looked at her and said, "You think this is about being wanted. That's the difference between us." She stared at me like I had started speaking another language. At home, the house remained what it had always been, honest. That was one of the reasons I survived the waiting. There is something about old houses that refuses to flatter anyone. The floor still creaked by the stair landing. The kitchen faucet still dripped if you turned it too hard. The wind still pushed salt against the porch screens at night. I slept in the bedroom that used to be my grandparents', and sometimes woke before dawn, convinced I could hear my grandmother opening the pantry door or my grandfather clearing his throat downstairs. I missed them with a physical ache. That part never softened. But grief, I learned, can coexist with purpose. You can miss someone and still use what they taught you. Daniel prepared meticulously. He built the case like a carpenter builds something meant to hold weight. Documents first, then records, then testimony, then motive. He had the trust formation timeline, the notary confirmation, the audio recording, the nurse's statement, the handyman's statement, my travel and expense records, and, most damning of all, the screenshot about the debt issue, plus copies of email exchanges Sienna had accidentally included me on, with a wedding planner discussing whether late summer would be ideal before the property is listed. Listed, not preserved, not kept in the family. Listed. The hearing was held in a courthouse 2 towns inland, in a room that smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and polished wood. It was not dramatic in the movie sense. No one pounded tables, no one shouted. The violence in courtrooms like that is always cleaner than that. It happens through words arranged with precision. My mother wore navy and carried tissues she barely used, but kept visible. My father looked grayer than usual. Sienna wore pale pink, like innocence had been assigned a dress code. I wore a dark suit Daniel told me was exactly right because it made me look serious and impossible to trivialize. Before we went in, he said, "No matter what they say, do not help them tell their story. Calm is not surrender. Remember that." The first hour was almost surreal. Their attorney described me as emotionally dependent on my grandparents, overwhelmed by grief, isolated, attached to the house in ways that impaired judgment. He described my parents as concerned, stabilizing figures, trying to protect family assets from mismanagement. Concerned, stabilizing. If my life had not been hanging inside those lies, the language would have been almost elegant. Then Daniel stood up. He did not begin with feeling. He began with dates. He walked the court through my grandmother's diagnosis, my grandfather's decline, the trust execution, the recorded deed transfer, the notary confirmation. Then he laid out the care history. He called the nurse. He introduced receipts. He showed that for nearly 3 years, I was the person consistently present in the house handling medication, meals, repairs, appointments, bills, emergencies. He did not argue that I loved my grandparents more. He showed that I did more. Then he introduced the audio recording. My mother's attorney objected. The judge reviewed the transcript and admitted it for a limited purpose. When my grandfather's voice filled the room, older, thinner, but unmistakably his, every nerve in my body tightened. "I am making these decisions of my own free will," he said. "My granddaughter Billie has cared for this house, and for us when others did not. I do not want the property sold under pressure or used to rescue anyone from debt. This is intentional. This is final, for the first time." All morning, my father looked rattled. Daniel didn't stop there. He brought in the email about listing the house. Then the wedding planner note about using the property before sale. Then Sienna's text about the debt issue. He layered them one after another until the supposed concern for my well-being stood exposed as a scramble for an asset. When it was time to question my father, the courtroom went unusually still. Daniel asked him whether he had told me to vacate the property before any court had ruled. Yes. He asked whether he had proposed family management after discovering the trust. Yes. He asked whether his business was, at the time, under significant financial pressure. Objection. Narrowly allowed. My father tried to evade, talking about market conditions and business cycles and temporary strain. Then Daniel asked, "Were you seeking immediate control of the property because sale or refinancing would have relieved that pressure?" My father looked at the judge, then at his lawyer, then at me. For 1 second, I saw exactly what he was deciding: whether to preserve dignity or reach for control one last time. He chose control. "We only needed her to stop being selfish long enough to sign," he said. so the family could stabilize. The silence after that was absolute. Even he seemed to realize, a beat too late, that he had said the quiet part out loud. The judge's expression hardened in a way I will never forget. When the ruling came, it came quickly and without ornament. The trust was valid. The challenge was denied in full. The court found no credible evidence of undue influence. The record overwhelmingly supported my role as primary caregiver and steward of the property. The attempt to pressure me into vacating before legal resolution was criticized explicitly. A portion of my legal fees was awarded. Contact restrictions were put in place for a set period outside formal legal channels unless I consented in writing. My mother cried then, but not beautifully. Not in the controlled way she did at funerals and public disappointments. She cried like someone whose reflection had just been shown to her under hard light. Sienna stared at the table, stunned and furious. My father looked suddenly older than I had ever seen him. Outside the courthouse, nobody spoke to me. They passed by as if I were something sharp. I sat in my car afterward with both hands on the steering wheel and did not turn the engine on for almost 10 minutes. Not because I was afraid, because it was over. And endings, even good ones, can be hard for the body to believe. The drive back to Westmere Cove felt shorter than usual. Maybe because for the first time in months, I was not driving toward a threat. I was driving home. The house looked exactly the same as it always had from the road. Same cedar siding, silvered by weather, same porch rail, same stand of pines, bending a little under the coastal wind. Nothing about it announced victory. It was simply still there. I unlocked the front door and stood in the foyer for a long time without moving. Then I went into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and reached automatically for my grandfather's old mug with the blue rim and the chip near the handle. I made tea and carried it out to the back porch. The water was darkening toward evening. A gull cried somewhere down by the marsh. The garden beds were half asleep for the season, though rosemary still held its scent if you brushed it with your hand. I sat in the old porch chair and let the quiet come back into me one breath at a time. I thought I would feel triumph. Instead, I felt release. Not because I had won, because I had stopped asking to be chosen by people who only saw value when it could be transferred to them. That, I think, was the deepest wound beneath everything else. Not the legal threat, not the house. The old child's hope that one day my parents would see me clearly and be fair because of it. I had carried that hope longer than it deserved, long enough for it to sour into self-doubt every time they looked at Sienna with easy pride and at me with measured disappointment. When I was 12, I won a statewide essay contest, and my mother missed the ceremony because Sienna had dance rehearsal. When I was 16, my father told me I needed to stop making everything so intense after I confronted him for forgetting my birthday dinner. When I was 23 and exhausted from commuting to take care of my grandparents while finishing school, my mother told me I was too attached to struggle. There had always been a shape to their love, conditional, performative, easier to access if I wanted less. My grandparents loved differently. They loved with presence, with repetition, with a steadiness that did not need to be advertised. They showed up, they noticed, they remembered. They made room for my silences without treating them as failures. That evening on the porch, I realized I had not merely protected the house. I had protected the only proof I'd ever had that love could be quiet and still be real. In the weeks that followed, consequences rippled outward exactly the way Daniel said they would. My father stepped down from a civic board he had always been very proud to sit on. Sienna's fiance's parents, having learned that the house was not about to become an asset in their daughter-in-law's orbit, suddenly developed concerns about financial timing. The wedding was not canceled, but it shrank. The guest list thinned. The venue changed. My mother stopped attending church for a month, then returned with a new version of events in which she had been misunderstood. I let them have their stories. That was another thing I had learned. Not every lie needs your voice pressed against it. Some lies collapse on their own under the weight of reality. Spring came slowly that year. The rosemary revived first, then the hydrangeas, then the climbing roses my grandmother had planted along the side fence decades ago. I repaired the porch steps. I repainted the downstairs guest room. I gave away boxes of old china no one used and kept the things that held memory honestly. My grandmother's recipe cards with butter stains on the corners, my grandfather's tools, the quilt from the foot of their bed, the small brass bell she used to ring when supper was ready. One rainy afternoon in April, I found myself standing in the study with the safe open again, not because I needed anything from it, but because I wanted to look at my grandfather's last letter one more time. He had written it by hand in the uneven but stubborn script age had given him. Billie, if you are reading this after I'm gone, then the house has already begun teaching its final lesson. Some people love places because of what those places hold. Some people love places because of what can be extracted from them. Don't confuse the two. You stayed. That matters. Not because sacrifice makes you noble, but because presence reveals character over time. Let the house keep honest people and expose dishonest ones. That is all it has ever done. Do not turn bitter. Bitterness is another inheritance people leave behind when they don't know what to do with their shame. Live here if it makes you peaceful. Sell it one day if peace asks something different. But let the choice be yours and not the result of pressure disguised as duty. Love, Granddad, I cried then. Properly. Not the controlled crying of funerals or hearings or court parking lots. I sat in his old chair with the letter in my hand and cried like someone finally safe enough to stop bracing. Afterward, I made soup and opened all the windows for a few minutes to let the rain smell in. Life did not become magically beautiful after that. That would be dishonest. Peace is not glamour. It is not a score settled forever. Some mornings I still woke angry. Some afternoons I saw a woman in the grocery store wearing my mother's perfume and had to leave my cart at the end of an aisle because my chest had gone tight. Sienna sent 2 emails through a mediator in the months that followed. One angry, one almost tender, both ultimately asking for something. I never answered either one. But other things entered my life too. I started working for the regional clinic network in a role that allowed me to stay local. I became friends with a woman named Mara, who ran the bookstore on Main Street and swore like a sailor while arranging poetry displays with the care of a jeweler setting stones. I began taking my tea down to the water at dawn sometimes, wrapped in one of my grandfather's old sweaters, and watching the first light make the surface look almost silver. I learned the names of neighbors I had only waved to before. I hosted a dinner one Sunday for the nurse, the handyman, Daniel, Mara, and the elderly couple from 2 houses down who had brought casseroles after both. Funerals. We sat around the old table in the kitchen and laughed and passed bread and talked until the candles burned low. Halfway through the evening, Mara looked around the room and said, "This house finally feels like it can exhale." She was right. Years later, because yes, there were years after, and they mattered. I would come to think of that season not as the time I fought my family, but as the time I stopped mistaking access for love. That distinction changed everything. People talk a lot about forgiveness, as if it is always the holiest ending. I don't know that I believe that anymore. Some forgiveness is real and earned and tender. Some is just another way women are asked to make other people comfortable before they are ready. What I found instead was something less dramatic and more durable. I found boundaries that did not apologize for existing. I found evidence. I found peace that did not depend on being understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. And in the end, I found home in the truest sense, not just the structure itself, but the right to remain inside my own life without asking permission. The last time I saw my mother in person was almost a year after the hearing, at the farmer's market in town. She looked older, smaller somehow, though still beautifully dressed. She approached me slowly, Like someone nearing a stray animal she was not sure would bolt. "Billie," she said, "you look well. So do you." We stood there among buckets of peonies and crates of strawberries and the sharp green smell of basil. For a second, I saw the life we might have had if she had been a different kind of mother, not perfect, just honest. The loss of that possibility hurt in its own old way. She said, "I know you think I was the villain." I almost smiled. "You were yourself." She flinched. Then she said something surprising. "I did love my mother." "I know," I said. "You just didn't show it when it mattered." Her face folded inward around that truth. I thought she might argue. She didn't. Instead, she nodded once, as though admitting something to herself more than to me, and said, "That's fair." It was the first honest sentence I had ever heard from her that did not immediately ask for absolution. We did not reconcile. Life is not a storybook, and not every broken thing deserves to be glued. But we stood there for another minute in the spring sunlight while people moved around us, carrying flowers and bread and bunches of herbs, and I felt no need to rescue the moment from what it was. It was small, incomplete, human. Then she said goodbye and walked away. I bought peonies and took them home and put them in my grandmother's blue vase. That night, as the sky turned lavender over the water, I sat again on the back porch with tea in the old chipped mug. The house was quiet behind me. The boards creaked softly under my chair. Somewhere down by the marsh, frogs had started up their evening song. I looked out at the cove and thought about my grandfather's letter, about the years of showing up, about the courtroom, about the little girl I had been and the woman I had become. I understood then that the ending was never really the moment my parents lost the house. The ending was the moment I stopped believing that their inability to love me rightly said anything final about my worth. That was the inheritance they never intended to leave me. And yet, I took it anyway. If you had come by the house the next morning just after sunrise, you would have seen an ordinary scene. A woman in the kitchen, in a worn sweater, bread toasting. The window cracked open to let the salt air in. A kettle beginning to sing. Nothing cinematic, nothing triumphant. But that is the truth of most victories. They do not look like victories from the outside. They look like peace returning to a room that has not felt safe in years. And peace, once it really arrives, is never small.